Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We're very excited to have you join. First, before we start, I would just like to acknowledge the land that we are on. I would like to acknowledge the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Nanapowick, and the Atawandran peoples whose traditional lands we are gathered upon today. Thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully in the next hour, we'll be able to share some perspectives about why we are here. We've come together today to share ideas and ways we can work together to ensure a healthy, just, and actionable recovery from this pandemic. But there is more to this recovery than jobs and the economy. The recovery is not just about returning to an old, comfortable normal, and it's not about building a false new normal based on old habits. We got here because we weren't responsible stewards of the environment and our global community. And if we are to address the pandemic, we have to cleanse more than just our hands. We have to cleanse our conscience from years of colonization and systemic racism. We have to work together to decide what recovery really means. We need to be intentional about ensuring that in the new reality, everyone feels safe, everyone feels like they belong, and we will commit to nurturing healthier, more inclusive communities where we can protect ourselves from COVID, as well as from the injustices that have marginalized entire communities and racialized people because of the color of their skin, their creed, their ethnicity, and their gender, to name a few. We can and we must do better. A healthy recovery means we are committed to awakening from our ignorance and becoming better and more aware of our responsibilities to the climate and to each other, and that we are ready to take action. From the outbreak of the pandemic in North America, the virus was already drawing deeper lines between an already damning racial divide. COVID was referred to as the Chinese flu. And while it's still premature, we are learning that the virus is impacting people of color, marginalized communities, and the most vulnerable at an alarmingly faster rate than those who are white or in higher socioeconomic class. And when the murder of George Floyd, a racial reckoning brought people out of isolation and into the streets to unanimously support the Black Lives Movement. We know that the poor and most vulnerable are on the brunt of this pandemic. And while we need to support a healthy return to a strong economy, we need to be intentional about how we address oppression and racism right here in our community and in our recovery efforts. At this time, I'd like to thank Mayor Ed Holder for providing us with a video. We were just before this session started having technical difficulties of showing that video, but we have shared it on our Twitter and the Facebook and the Eventbrite, as well as the various social medias that we're all sharing to. We will share that with you afterwards as well. But at this time, I want to turn it around and introduce you to our panelists, to whom I'm greatly indebted for giving us their time and sharing their perspectives. Dr. Javeed Sukhera, a psychiatrist and chair of London's Police Board. Kate Graham, Director of Research at the Canadian Urban Institute. Andrea Jibb, Director of Community Planning at CLOSA. Arielle Kayabaga, Ward 13 Councillor, City of London. And Luis Patricio from the London Poverty Research Center. Of course, we can't forget the two people who are working behind the scenes, Paul Seal, a community builder and manager for membership engagement for Pillar Nonprofit Network, and Greg Picken, communications manager for Technical Alliance. Both of these people are moderating the chat, listening to what you have to say, so that when we open the session a little later, we can make sure to address your questions and hopefully any concerns that you have or things you would like to share with us. I'd also like to thank Dillon Consulting for their generosity and for making a contribution to Atlosa Family Healing Services. I'd also like to thank the London Poverty Research Center for providing the technology that we're using to connect today, as well as Tech Alliance for helping us spread the word and make sure that we can reach you, our esteemed participants today. And of course, so many thanks to all of you who have taken the time today to be part of this incredibly important discussion, but more important, about how we can together come up with ways that we can create a healthier stronger, more inclusive collective recovery. So a warm welcome to you, a warm welcome to our dedicated panelists, and thank you in advance for sharing your passion and desire to help fellow Londoners recover and build a stronger, healthier, and more inclusive community. Just a couple things to note about the format today. So I will be asking questions of the various panelists who are on with us. They will have 2 minutes, not longer, to respond. And then at around 5:40, we're going to ask Paul and Greg to give us a reminder to open up the discussion so you can share in the discussion and you can ask your questions. At 5:50, we'll be asking the panelists and the participants to share our ideas. What sort of call to action will we be having so that we can individually and collectively support a healthy and just recovery? And then at 5:58, I will be turning it over to a colleague of mine, Christina Fox, for closing remarks, and then we'll thank you for being here today. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the questions. And my first question is addressed to Javeed and Arielle. We'll start with you, Javeed. So London entered phase 3 recently, notwithstanding there are fears of a second wave. We are dealing with the alarming rising numbers in the United States. We're preparing to return to school in mid-September. Early September, and amidst all these uncertainties, what do you see as the greatest obstacle to a healthy recovery from COVID?
So thank you for the opportunity to join, and thank you to everybody for their time who's listening in today. It's hard to distill it all down to one thing that's the greatest obstacle. I think there really are two things that I would highlight. Early in the days of when we were all just trying to understand what was going on and experiencing an extreme amount of uncertainty, an extreme amount of confusion, and noticing that our daily lives had been changed in ways we had never imagined. One of the things that we began to appreciate is how much our society, our community may have prioritized things like productivity over well-being. And I think that this realization, this opportunity to open our eyes about what has been driving us really is something that we can't lose sight of. The question about opening an economy or opening schools versus making decisions that prioritize the physical and psychological health of ourselves and others is what's leading to some of the tragic consequences in other places around the world. So I think the greatest obstacle to recovery for us really is our mindset. Are we going to continue to prioritize productivity over well-being? Are we going to continue to prioritize profit over people? Because if we do, then I think we're going to go back to the way things were. And I know I personally don't want to go back to the way things were. I want to look forward to something better. And I want to build that together with my fellow community members.
Thank you, Javeed. And that's a powerful statement, people over profits. We know that the world came to a standstill when COVID took over and we started getting used to what some people are calling a new normal, which for most of us is nothing that we want to replicate because the new normal is just built on old habits, and we want to go to something that really prioritizes the people over the profits. It can be done. We did it. We stopped the world economically to reset, and we need to do it going forward. So thank you. I know we'll get to this later when we talk about the inequities in our community, but we saw how shortly after we started feeling a little more courageous, we started shifting back, and the people who were helping us most, we started moving back towards the profits and away from the people. Arielle, what can you add to the conversation?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for adding us into this conversation. So I do think I'm just going to add on to what Javeed just mentioned. But I think one of the things that we need to recognize first is that especially in London, we have been, successful at keeping the numbers low. I'd like to thank the health unit for all the work that they've done and our staff members over there, and the medical officer of health and all the work that the entire team has done to make sure that we really get a grip of COVID-19. I'm sure that at this point, many of you understand and have seen the many gaps and the many loopholes in our systems, in different ways that our cities are built and are structured, and the funding of our cities, many ways that COVID has exposed a lot of the gaps that we have in the system, and who are the most vulnerable people in our communities, which are always the elderly people, women, children, people of color, Black and Indigenous people. And if some of you have followed some of those numbers, you will see that if you're really looking to go back to a norm, then that's really problematic, because what seemed to be normal for people is no longer the norm, and it has really been exposed to be very problematic. And this isn't something new. This is something that many people have been talking about for a very long time. We just really needed to see it and to see the data. And Canada hasn't really been a champion in collecting any race-based data up until COVID-19. So, I mean, I think some of the obstacles that we can see is people not wanting to shift their minds to see where this new norm could be going. Personally, I have seen a lot of people, move towards shifting and changing and making sure that we're ready for whatever new start that COVID is going to bring towards us. I'm more hopeful and more excited about what's to come, because we can rethink and reimagine and restructure what the board is going to look like. And that's going to really counter the obstacles. And we will continue to work on providing those support systems in place for people. So I don't know if those are obstacles, but those are my hopes and my observations of the COVID-19 so far.
Thank you. And I think when we look back to what Javeed was just saying a bit earlier about that, this is creating a new mindset. If we don't have visibility around the obstacles that you called out, Arielle, then we can't actually shift our mindset to where it needs to focus. And of course, the leaders in our community, the leaders at City Hall, our medical health practitioners are really at the forefront of making sure that we can keep that mindset where it needs to be. So we are grateful. We've got a lot of work to do, and that's in part why we're here today. So thank you both. Javeed, we're going to come back to you and just discuss with regards to, again, moving forward. We've heard much about the economic impact of COVID and its toll on our economy. So this toll is something that it's taken in the very recent past, and it's a toll that's going to take in the future. The money that the government has given to help us recuperate and to stay afloat has to be paid somewhere, right? But we've also heard from health experts about the mental and the emotional impacts, and those discussions have been front and center. Still, the fear of contamination, resistance to some people wearing a mask to help curb the spread of COVID, the negative effect of social distancing, the loss of livelihood, and unfortunately, the loss of life. Those are causing more uncertainty and fear. And as we move forward, what suggestions, Javeed, can you provide to ensure that we provide helpful ways to manage the stress of the pandemic? And how can we learn to deal with this becoming part of life? Javeed.
So what we're experiencing right now, in many ways, we're experiencing collectively. This chronic stressor of the pandemic, along with all the uncertainty, has put us all as a community into a shared experience of stress and a shared experience of vulnerability. For some in our community, it is the economic uncertainty that comes with the pandemic. There are many who were struggling with these issues even before the pandemic, and for them, it's even worse. But with everything that's happening, I think we have to appreciate that the existing ways that many of us may have coped aren't going to be enough right now. And if we continue to try to fix our feelings, we're going to continue to fall into spirals of toxic thinking and things like doom scrolling, where people are just spending so much time burning their energy in negative ways. What I think we should be working on is doing things that enhance our sense of control, predictability, in moderation, having structure, finding a middle ground, but also having compassion for ourselves. we're all going through this together. I say this to patients and families all the time. Just like them, I'm bumbling through things one day at a time. We're all human, we're all imperfect, and we have to really appreciate and acknowledge that shared and true vulnerability. The other thing is we have to think about ways to cope that are really acceptance focused. So what can we do to ensure that we accept reality and stop fighting reality? We accept what's outside of our control, but also think about the things that are within our control, especially as we move forward into the fall and all the uncertainty that we're facing in that sense.
Thank you, Javeed. And what I sense is bringing us back to that mindset and the fact that we are in control of our own environment, and the things that we can control really come back to us to be more aware of what we're doing, to be compassionate with ourselves. So I can see the trend here that, hopefully by the end of the session today, each one of us can figure out how can we deal with this pandemic on a personal basis, and hopefully we can start going to discussions of how we can deal on a collective basis. And I want to turn to Kate now and that sense of collectivity. So Kate, by the way, congratulations on becoming a mother. We all celebrate with you.
It's been a big week.
So thank you so much. In spite of everything, or because of everything, you still have come to us. And I think that sense of community is one that you've carried with you. And this is why, I'm excited to ask you this question, because about the silent population we've heard very little about. During the time we were being told to socially distance and isolate, those who were in abusive relationships found themselves even more isolated than because of the aggressors that they were living with. So while there's been some respite from isolation during the summer months, with fear of another spike in the fall, how do we protect these victims? And what lessons have we learned from the first wave?
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, thank you very much for convening this discussion. And thanks to everyone who's made time to tune in. Mohammed, as you said in the introduction, I work at the Canadian Urban Institute. And one of the projects we've undertaken is to produce a report about the impacts of COVID in Canadian communities every 100 days until whenever it's not relevant anymore. So you can find the first report at covid100.ca. And the punchline of the research, to save you reading a 100-page document, is very similar to things we've already talked about in this discussion, that our experiences with COVID have depended largely on who we are and where we live. And the existing inequalities have been deepened. And so for people who are, were already isolated in some way, for people who are already experiencing some form of threat. So, for example, many women who are in a situation where they're experiencing domestic violence, those situations become exacerbated. And there's others on this call who are more qualified to speak specifically about that. But we know that where isolation exists, it's deepening. But I do think there is some silver lining here, in that we also see communities coming together in unprecedented ways. And sometimes these are small things. These are, neighborhood Facebook groups who are picking up groceries for one another. Sometimes it's people reaching out. I know I've got family members that I feel like, I've talked to more during the pandemic, who live in Prince Edward Island, for example, and we have made time for regular Zoom calls in a way that we didn't before. So I think we need to continue to do that and be very deliberate and appreciate that, it's an isolating time for everyone. It's particularly so for people in some circumstances, people who live alone, people who are at some form of risk, and each of us take the time to reach out to the people around us. It always matters, but I think it especially matters right now. And that's the power of community, right? Is when people come together because it matters and it helps each of us. And this is a moment where we all need to step up and do exactly that.
Thank you, Kate. And I think that really resonates in the fact that we saw with everyone, whether it was the way that we were being marketed to from the various companies, when we are isolated, we were watching some television, people were reaching out to us through our media, and it really is about community. And I think we have to keep that focus on community, right? So after this session, I think one of the things that we can do is remind people of the various services and organizations in the community that are helping the distressed, the most vulnerable. So, I'll reach out to the colleagues that we have on here and some who have information about what some of these services are. For example, we're accepting donations to Atlosa Family Healing Services because of the change they're making in our community to people who don't have a safe space, a space where they can be themselves, and to recognize the value of being centered. So there are many such spaces for women in abusive relationships, men in abusive relationships. So I think it's important to remind myself as others, what are those organizations and what are those services, so that if we want to donate our time or our resources or our money, we know where we can go. And I think we need to, ahead of a second wave, hopefully we don't have one, but ahead of what may be coming in September, let's get ready. Let's put some things aside so that we're there to prepare for each other and to continue living that collectivity together. Thank you, Kate. Moving on to the next question. This one is to Luis. How do we provide the most vulnerable with access to green spaces, recreational facilities, jobs, basic needs stores, and all that the city has to offer, and during and after the pandemic? So we'll go to you, Luis, for 2 minutes, and then we're going to ask Arielle, again, with your expertise in the city, to add to the conversation. Luis.
Thanks for organizing. Thanks for everyone who are participating here. And I think there are two ways to answer that question. And the first one is affordability. When we say access, we can think in terms of affordability, thinking, can you pay for this and that? And, some of us just can't. So we tend to think in terms of growth, making sure that everybody makes enough money to pay the current cost of living. And this might not be possible or even desirable with our current rate of material consumption. So the other option that we have is to lower the cost of what we need. So to redesign our urban space to foster resilience. The most basic example that I can think of is food. So we're talking about shifting gears to recovery, right? The transition, talking about implementing our urban agriculture strategy, expanding the community gardens, investing in initiatives like Urban Roots London, supporting small local farmers around London, or even simply recreating the conditions where people can enjoy spending time in public spaces for free. Like we have the car-free street on Dundas Place, and that's a great project. But not only in business areas, car-free neighborhoods are great too. They can rebuild the social fabric for all ages and abilities. The second way we can think about access is mobility. Can we get to places? And if you can't afford a car, that means you have to risk riding a bike without the proper infrastructure, or wake up much earlier to take the bus. Not owning a car means you're deprived of many job opportunities, and they explicitly ask for that in job descriptions here in London. You have restricted access to public spaces, green spaces, and many public services. So we can talk about equality, really, if you're, and be inclusive without addressing the urban mobility issue. And this intersects with all sorts of inequality: gender, racial, immigrant status, income, and many others. So one of the things we need to do is rethink our urban patterns of sprawling suburban developments and road widening that foster inequality, and they are really a money pit. We need to focus on increasing density and really investing in cycling and transit, like the BRT that we have right now. And thinking about especially the most vulnerable, we need to offer these options to provide them access to all that the city has to offer. It's already unsustainable as it is. Not everybody can drive, and you don't want everybody to drive. So those are the two ways that we can think about access to the city.
Thank you, Luis. And I want to build on that. Some of the things that you called out, Luis, are things that we already have. Like the city has facilitated people being able to take transit for free during COVID, right? So I want to turn it over to Arielle for 2 minutes, and to help us build on how do we take some of the wish lists that we're discussing tonight, and how can we escalate them and surface those discussions at City Hall?
Thank you for this question. I think
no pressure.
No pressure at all. The answer for this question that I had, prepared to do was actually not even related to the way City Hall handles things, but I'll talk on the City Hall aspect. And if you do allow me some time, I will talk about the importance. And given that COVID has showed us the inequities that are in our communities, in different cities. And I think Kate knows more about this than I do, but I did read the report, and the report shows how COVID has affected more communities of color, Black and Indigenous people. And when we're talking about green spaces and or trying to eradicate racism as we move forward in COVID, green spaces are really important. Being able to provide territorial equity and creating more green space in our community is really important. And that goes into what Louis just talked about in terms of, having community gardens and making sure that we are not only just amplifying and creating those spaces, but we're actually supporting into the inclusivity of how these community gardens function, creating more, bicycle and pedestrian promenades in our communities, in our cities, which is exactly what he just said about, more spaces that are car free. We are doing a lot at the City of London, but we could do more. There's always more that could be done to create a more livable and a more connected community, so that when we face things like this, we're prepared, right? And this isn't the beginning. This is the beginning, actually. It's not the end. We could face something else like COVID-19 again. And we really need to also create multi-purpose community spaces that could be used to be green spaces and spaces where people meet together and make what a very amazing urbanist mentor of mine that I appreciate said, placemaking. We need to focus on placemaking in our communities, and that means building communities where people feel comfortable to even eat meals together. But speaking of what the City of London can do, there's a lot that the City of London can do. When we talk about BRT, and if we're going to link BRT to the inequities of COVID, you can look at the ways that we've allocated funds into BRT, or we've approved the BRT plan. Only 3 legs of the BRT were approved, and if you look at the areas where they're approved, they're mostly areas where there are poor communities there, or communities that take the bus more. And then our suburban areas didn't really get any BRT leg, which then decreases and encourage the segregation by design, what we talk about when we say segregation by design. And we think about the ways that certain neighborhoods actually can identify your social class. And that's segregation by design. So I think what we can do, and what we have been talking about at the City of London after the motion that I passed on making sure that we implement anti-racism into everything that we do, into all of our service areas. This is a discussion that's been ongoing for the last month on how we can design our city to be less segregated, to be less classist, and to be more connected, and we can make more places. And it's funny because when we're talking about it, you don't really realize it when you haven't lived any inequity or any discrimination or any barriers to services, to even like getting food or going to groceries that are more accessible, or so many things that we can talk about on the perspective of London. But we're actually starting to have the conversations around how can we switch that around? How can we talk about BRT being the bus or transportation being a right to every single person who lives in London, without really looking at people's social classes? How can we have more bike lanes without having to argue about, whether or not people pay enough taxes to be able to have access to bike lanes? How can we have a 15-minute livable place made area where people can have access to what they need, and they can have access to community gardens, and we can bring all those ideas together to make our city a very great city where people want to live, and not just students, and not just people who are retiring, but every single person can feel welcome and included, and also have a place to contribute into their community. So it's ongoing.
And Arielle, if I may, just to be respectful of time, because do you think that we could invite anyone who is on the call today? How can they be part of this conversation? So I know a lot of the time things happen at City Hall. We do our best to outward communicate. Perhaps in a link or in a thank you email for joining us tonight, we'll share some of these ways that they can engage in the conversation, contribute. Yeah. We would love to do that. And if we have time, we're going to come back to some of the things you were sharing with us. Thank you. Going to go to Andrea. And Andrea, we're talking about anti-racism, we're talking about safe spaces, and we're talking about the most vulnerable. Could you please tell us, how has COVID affected the Indigenous community in London?
Right, thank you. So what we're seeing happen in 2020 is the unfolding of simultaneous and complex crises. So we have a pandemic happening, there's a racism crisis, an economic crisis, and perhaps most concerning of all, there's the environmental crisis. And as Indigenous people, we understand that these crises are deeply interconnected. We see that the roots of these crises lie in an imbalance in the way that society exists under late capitalism in relationship with the earth, where we live in a society that continues to exploit earth systems and resources in a way that's simply not sustainable. And we understand the histories of colonization and slavery and anti-Black racism as a part of this legacy. So as Indigenous people, we've been dealing with the crisis of colonization for 500 years. And so this is to say that Indigenous peoples have intergenerational lived experience of what it means to be in crisis, but also that we have ancestral knowledge and wisdom of how to live through crisis. And so COVID-19 has become another layer of crisis that the Indigenous communities have had to face. And from what I've seen happen in the urban Indigenous community here in London, COVID-19 has showed me that Indigenous peoples have done as we've always done. So we've mobilized to support each other and do what we need to do to take care of ourselves and each other. So we've seen so many new programs come into place. We've had food programs come to feed children, and we've moved people experiencing homelessness into hotels and provided transitional support. We've deployed technology so that people can remain connected to crucial supports. We've hit the streets to hand out bottles of water and smudge kits that include traditional medicines. And most significantly of all, the Indigenous community in London has relied on ancestral knowledge that tells us that in times of crisis, we will be there for each other. We'll use our ceremonies and our medicines, and we have elders to remind us about our relationship with spirit for the healing of the virus and the earth.
And there's so much to learn from the natural ways that we can react or respond to this virus, right? And I think sometimes we depend too much on technology, and we realize that, as we're talking about right now, we do need to be together. We do need to connect. We do need to figure out what are the dynamics that bring people together to heal. And they're not always things that are far away from us. They're things that are, again, within us and around us, if we can just be a little more aware of them. So you touch upon something that I think, again, as a person of Indigenous heritage, as an Indigenous person, I would like to ask you as well, how do you feel that homelessness has been impacted to the Indigenous communities?
Yeah, so homelessness is another major crisis that we have happening here in London. And in particular, Indigenous people in this community make up 30% of the people who are experiencing homelessness. And so it's a homelessness, given that housing is the first line of defense against COVID, as we were all told to self-isolate, people without a home simply were not able to do so. And so it's my hope that in a COVID recovery focused world, that people will approach the issue of homelessness with much more compassion, because if anything, during the pandemic crisis, we saw the community mobilize to support people experiencing homelessness in very unique and quick ways. So we had people moved into hotels. We saw unique solutions around harm reduction to support people who needed to self-isolate. We saw a form of basic income with the CERB. So this shows that we can mobilize to support some of the most vulnerable community members in times of crisis.
And Andrea, I'm going to be courageous here. When you say we, you're not just talking about the services or activities within the Indigenous communities, or are you?
No, I would say that the community as a whole, and there are many homeless serving agencies within London, and we are just one small part of that.
Right. Well, I would say you're one great part of that. And I think that's, again, the impact and the power of these discussions. So I know that since we've become isolated at home, these Zoom meetings or these online meetings have only expounded, and the conversations continue to happen. We've had a few symposiums and other town halls, and there will be more. So what I would ask to everybody on this call today, please continue to not just listen, but to engage And in a few moments, we're going to allow you to engage and open up the chat, but be part of the discussion. More importantly, be part of the action. So COVID hasn't locked us up. We are more free now than we were 3 months ago. So there are ways that we can work with the community. There are ways that we can give back. There are ways that we can get into the streets. And we saw that when we came together and supported the Black Lives Movement. And before I go to a question on the Black Lives Movement, I do want to come back to Kate. Thank you, Andrea, by the way. I would like to come to Kate and ask Kate with regards to leadership and gender inequality. So women in the workforce has regressed by 3 decades in the first 120 days of COVID. This is scary, right? So what can we do about this?
Sure. Well, I think everything that Andrea just said, I want to listen to like 15 more times. I think there was a lot of power in that and in framing it as this convergence of crises. I think we see the same thing happening here with respect to gender and the many ways in which gender inequality is built into our society and our systems have become more pronounced. But it's also a moment where policy change appears to be more possible and possible faster than normal. So right now we see the pressures on things like our education system. We see big pressure on our childcare system, big decisions to make about how much we prioritize the safety of kids, knowing that, if school is not a safe environment for kids, we are not going to see women return to work. And there are big economic ramifications of that for us as a society. And there are also big social ramifications of that. So, right now we are seeing governments and people being put to the test about what actually matters to us. And we could go real deep on this, in education, in what we're prepared to do to make sure that kindergarten kids are safe in 26 days and so on. But if equality is something that we're working towards, and if we understand that we are in a moment of converging crises and we can't address one without understanding and addressing the others at the same time, we've got to take that sort of multidimensional approach that I think Andrea laid out so beautifully in her last response.
Thank you. And I could ask you to go into so much more around, GHG emissions and private vehicles and residential. And I know Louise and Arielle talked about that. So just the sort of green recovery that needs to be part of the discussion. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to shift around what leadership can do to help steer some of those decisions to help us have a greener recovery. So my question to you, and then we're going to ask Arielle to also weigh in, is around leadership. So this is about politics and about leadership. Gee, I think you like politics a bit, right?
I do.
Motherhood politics seems to be a trend these days for you. So what are you learning about? What's that?
They should go together more.
There you go. Well, I think that's why we talked about, making sure that women are part of the conversation. We can talk about it, but we have to be intentional to make sure that they're at the table and that the table is wider. And it's not by our decision that, we just look around us and we see that table has representation from gender, from different creeds, different sexual orientations, everyone who lives in our community. So thanks for the reminder. So about politics and leadership, what are we learning about the current expectations of political leaders during the time of crisis? So we'll go to you for a minute and a half, and then we're going to give a minute and a half to Arielle, please.
Sure. So just one interesting tidbit. We were doing quite a bit of research on how Canadians are experiencing COVID. And one of the interesting findings was that people are feeling more disconnected from their neighbors, from their colleagues, from their friends, and so on, but they're feeling more connected to political leaders than they normally are. And I think it's because political leaders are so present right now. We're watching them daily, giving updates. The information feels highly relevant in a way that sometimes it doesn't. So we're seeing political leadership be put to the test, and I think the expectations of leaders are higher. If I can throw in just a gender dimension, there's also been a lot of really interesting work done about nations that are led by women or have a lot of female participation in senior levels. Countries that are led by women have had 6 times fewer deaths in COVID as of about a month ago. That's a pretty significant difference. And one of the reasons is because female leaders tend to, and these are big broad brush statements, but or governments that have a lot of female representation tend to prioritize well-being. So back to Javeed's comments at the beginning about, what are we really here to do? Government should be about the well-being of people. And so leaders and governments who are prepared to prioritize the well-being of people, we're seeing that translate into life and death benefits. So expectations of leaders are higher, and having more women at the table is being demonstrated to actually have a benefit.
And I know you're working hard to make sure that that gets into place. So best of luck with that. Thank you. Same question over to Arielle. Arielle, you're at City Hall, you're at the table. Can you tell us what's your take on this?
I mean, I do want to, first of all, mention that COVID has multiplied, or if I could say quadrupled, our workload, especially for people who actually care to connect with their communities. I wanted to answer a little bit on what we can do to see or how we can respond to this decrease or how COVID has affected women. There's a lot that Kate has mentioned that I would just quickly mention a few points. We need to have interventions to address unpaid childcare. We need intervention to address digital and financial inclusion for women. We need intervention to address attitude biases in the way that we deal with women and inclusion, and we need to remove barriers for Black, Indigenous, and women of color. We need to address the healthcare crisis that we have in women of color and Indigenous and Black women. Maternal mortality is high, and also we need to continue. And if we haven't started, if there are communities that haven't started, we need to collect race-based data. It is important to collect race-based data so that we can actually see where the gaps are falling. And I'm not going to say everything that Kate just mentioned. I do agree and concur with what she's saying. In my 1 minute and 30 seconds, my last comment on this would be elect women, elect women, elect women, and elect women, and elect more women.
Thank you. And Arielle, we're going to give you another minute and 30 seconds because as a Black person, as a Black woman, we all came to the streets out of isolation to go to Victoria Park, 10,000 of us, right? That was the first Black Lives Movement that just really pushed us to come together. But I also saw that the consequent gathering was remarkably less Londoners. How do we prevent the loss of that momentum? And how do we make sure that the voices that have been silenced for way too long, that we can amplify them, and not only be those who amplify them, but invite those voices so they speak on their own part?
That's a very great question that I'm probably not going to have all the answers. I can give you my perspective and my opinion. I think the first thing that we need to realize is that, the Black Lives Matter, what people call a movement, is not a movement just to be a movement. It's not a trend. It's not something that started in May or June when George Floyd died. Many of us have been screaming to be less suffocated, to breathe, to have our voices heard, to stop the killings of Black children, of Black men, of Black women, unnecessarily, to stop the brutality on our lives for a very, 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 very long time. Fortunately for us, because of COVID, the way COVID was set up, a lot of people were very much listening and paying attention to the things that are happening around them. And this time around, we were heard, and we don't want to lose those voices. I think there's been a lot of educational supports for people to learn more and to kind of get to a place where people can learn and realize and recognize their privilege so that they can share their privilege. A lot of times people fear Black Lives Matter movement because it is a response to brutality. It is a response to violence, that people are going to be violent. One of the things that we have to understand is that poverty affects a lot more people than just Black people. Lack of access affects a lot more people than just Black people. Healthcare is not even accessible to people. Jobs are not accessible to people. Education is not accessible to people. So I think all of this stuff has happened to holistically open our eyes to our system and the way that our system has functioned for so many years, and the people that our system not only left behind but trampled upon to be able to continue to thrive. So if we really want to address this, we really have to address how we approach our system, who we elect, our policies. I know that everybody in their own field, in their own area, there's something they can do. From the minute you leave your house to the way that you engage with the people that you see on the street can make a huge difference. I talked about the other day how racism is not my history. It's not something that I wake up thinking about. But racism every day wakes up trying to find me. I don't wake up thinking I'm a Black woman, but when I leave my house, I'm always reminded I'm a Black woman. So that tells me so much more about my society than what I am. And I think we have to get to a place where we need to do more listening and intent work to be more inclusive and to change our policies and to change our systems than just to be so quick at defending. It's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to be in a place where you don't understand what's happening, but be willing to listen, be willing to build relationships. And all of these things are going to come when we continue to address, again, how the system functions, how we have designed our cities, how we have designed our communities to be more segregated. So if we remove the segregation that has happened by class, by jobs, by gender, and all these things, then we can get to a place where we can start seeing some alleviations on the post-racial society that we are trying to create.
And we've gone around the question, but we haven't called it by its name, the ugliness of systemic racism, right? It exists. And, the video that we'll share with you after from our respected mayor talks about that it's here. And if whether we have more or less than other cities is irrelevant, we have it and we have to work hard to do it. And, while diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice. And how do we choose every day to look at people, to celebrate their differences and not to, to create barriers because of those differences, right? Yeah. And so, and whether we're doing it in our workplaces, whether we're doing it in our homes, the conversations that we're having, we really have to be very aware. And it's about peeling back all these layers of privilege that each one of us have, right? Each one of us on this call has so many layers of privilege that prevent us from becoming more awake and aware. And this is why we're here today. It's about to talk about great. We're talking about it, but I really want us to pull away and say, are we ready to act? So before we ask how we can collectively create a vision towards collective healing, which is why we're here, one more question that I would like to address to Luis. And Luis, this question is about, we've mentioned that the pandemic is hurting the most vulnerable in our communities, right? We know that. From warehouse to retail and restaurant workers, those with low-paying jobs, wage-earning, non-unionized jobs have been consistently the most vulnerable to losing their jobs. And according to Stats Canada, 38.1% of people who earned less than $16 an hour have lost their jobs from the start of the shutdown. And while office workers have adapted to working remotely, the lowest paid minimum wage earning working class employees find themselves compromised and at risk and working for a lower wage. So, yeah, and when I think about this, it really irks me because those were the people that we were celebrating. And right when things started to get better, we took away the extra that we were recognizing them for. So what are some key recovery strategies to ensure that wealth stays in the local economy, but that it's also distributed more equitably, more consistently? Over to you, Luis.
Thanks, Mohammed. That's a great question. And we've been talking about our systemic problems and our emergency response, but I want to jump because the title of the event is recovery. I want to jump into the recovery stage, and one of the things that we really need to do is ensure that the money pumped into the local economy stays in the local economy. And that's important because even if you manage, say, to create a local CERB to ensure all Londoners have a temporary basic income, or if you provide jobs to many of us who are now unemployed, eventually we'll be struggling with poverty again and that inequality. And the reason why is that the money that we use to acquire many of the goods and services consumed in the city, it just leaks out. Just to give a basic example, this is a report that is available in the site on the City of London website. 90% of the money, and that's $1.5 billion a year, spent on energy, leaks out of London. And at varying degrees, the same is true for the food, entertainment, and many other industries, even housing. Another thing is that for the chunk that the money that remains here, there's no mechanism to foster a more equal distribution. So to address the first challenge, which is retention, we have community benefit agreements and social procurement policies. And our politicians in the municipal, provincial, and federal level, they're aware of those mechanisms. And basically what they do is to ensure that big projects and the huge purchase power that are directed to our local economy, they stay here. We have big institutions in our city. We have hospitals, post-secondary institutions, the City of London itself, and they can be intentional about who they're purchasing from. Like millions of dollars could stay in those local businesses. And there are examples from just across the lake, and in Cleveland and around the world. And to address the second part, distribution, we need to promote community ownership. And by ownership, I mean that the workers have the decision-making power and a fair share of the profits. One of the most significant examples is the employee-owned businesses and worker co-ops. They're more conducive to profit sharing and more resilient during crisis as well. So with the baby boomer generation right now and with COVID, we're predicting about 1 million jobs in the next 15 years that will disappear or will be absorbed by big corporations, and again, leakage of money. And this is a huge opportunity to convert those business and make sure that the money stays in the community.
Thank you, Luis. And I could ask questions all day and we could try to come up with answers, and there's no shortage of great perspectives to share here. And I want to be respectful of the people who have been listening, and I want to turn it over to Paul and Greg. I know there's some questions that are coming through. Could we ask one of the questions, which I think is why we're all here, which is, what are our collective visions for all working together towards collective healing? And I hope I pronounced the name properly, Joanne Wong. So thank you, Joanne. So what is, I'm going to actually turn around to each of our panelists and give you a whole 1 minute, 60 seconds. I'll be timing you. What do you think our collective vision to working towards our collective healing? We'll start with Andrea.
So in my way of thinking, it's very important to rethink emergency responses that focus on the symptoms of the crisis versus the causes, so the system level causes. And so I'm thinking, what I'm hearing is that the collective response is to do the work to understand our roles in that system, because we're all involved in some way or another.
Thank you, Andrea. We're going to go down to Kate. And I say down, Kate, because on my screen, you're just, so we'll go to you next.
So 5 days ago, I gave birth to a baby girl, and it was a much more complicated process than expected, ending in a surgery. And so the word recovery for me has become very personal over the last few days. And although it's tough, I think for each of us, we are in a moment where, paying attention to the vital signs, quite literally, of what's going well and what's not, thinking about what are our small and big goals that we're working towards, and really focusing on the well-being of people. Anyone who's recovered from anything from a pregnancy to experiencing a pandemic knows that it has a major impact on our well-being. And if that's something that we truly care about, this is a moment where we have an opportunity to pay attention to the signs around us, connect with other people, reach out to see who needs a hand, and focus on the well-being of ourselves and the people around us.
Thank you, Kate. And I underscore the fact that, yes, it is the science, because we have to listen to those who know best. So thank you for the reminder. We'll go to Javeed next.
So I think there's no manual or algorithm that can tell us how to move forward. We're all going to have to figure this out together. But what we can do is resist the finger pointing, the blame, the kind of dichotomization that I think is commonplace in our discourse. In many ways, we're coming closer together, but in many ways, I think we're being driven further apart. We aren't having enough human-to-human conversations with one another, and we continue to sort of perform in our different echo chambers without leaning in, rolling up our sleeves, and doing the hard work that it's going to take to move forward. That hard work is going to mean designing policy in an inclusive way with people who are affected by that policy. And that hard work is going to mean that we resist the urge to point the finger at each other to say, this person's not doing that, that person's not doing this. And we begin to focus on who we are and the kind of role models we're going to be for the kind of change that we want to seek in our community.
Thank you, Javeed. And as you were talking about that change, Andrea, your daughter or your son came in, and I think part of that change, Javeed, is the normalization of what wasn't okay before, but what is okay now. So as we're writing, those new policies and talking about what inclusion can look like, we need to make sure that we're facilitating it, making it easier for people, whether we're making it easier for a mother to embrace her child on camera, or whether we're bringing work home with us and having those discussions in safe spaces. It's really looking at who do we invite, or how do we make sure that they're at the table. And I'm careful there because it's not about invitation. I'm not going to wait for somebody to ask me to sit at the table. I want to make sure there's a seat for me, and I will assume it. So to that, I will go over to Luis. And Luis, your 60 seconds on our collective healing.
Thanks, Mohammed. I think we are in a moment, and I could just say what Andrea said, what Javeed said, because this is so powerful. And I think we're in a moment where COVID exposed, make us aware of so many things that are happening. And part of creating that collective vision is that awareness, and we're raising that awareness. A lot of the work that we do at the Poverty Research Center is really trying to make those connections. And one of our projects is around the Sustainable Development Goals. And our core message is integration. It's really integration about the social, economic, and ecological challenges that we have, but also integration about the different sectors and about the different people involved. And some of the answers that I gave before, it speaks a little bit to what Dr. Javeed said. It's just creating that space where we can meet whoever is people that are different, they have different opinions, they have a different background, they're different gender, they're different age, just being exposed on a regular basis to those opinions and being able to just accept and see that we have so much more in common with whoever is close to us than we have differences. I think this is what needs for us to achieve the collective vision. And the last thing I want to say just quickly is that our emergency response was awesome. There's so many initiatives, but I think we need to think beyond the boat with a hole, and we're just taking water out of the boat with a bucket. We need to fix those holes, and maybe we need to find a new boat. So that collective vision, and at some point, as we're exposed to each other, is to think about the strategies. They're not only preventing the boat to sink, but to keep the boat stable, even when we face a storm or, say, a global pandemic.
Thank you, Luis. And so eye-opening, because it's a matter of how do we take the resilience of what we've learned over the past 6 months, 5 months, and how do we apply it going forward? Because I don't want to use the word new normal, but a more wholesome, more inclusive new reality where we all adapt and we do it collectively. And to help us understand how we can further do that, over to you, Arielle. How do we do that collectively?
So I don't think I have the manual to figure out how to do that, but I can share what I've been doing to survive and to continue into a recovery process. So in January of 2020, I was going through a lot. I lost a nephew. I faced a very challenging experience on council. And in that midst, someone sent me a book. I don't know who that person is. I bless them every day. I have no idea who this person is. But this book is called The Mental Fight by Ben Okri. And this book has really grounded me during COVID-19. I'm just going to share a really, really small passage and I'll be done. He talks about, I hear them talk about the end of history, but those of us who haven't tasted the best fruits of time yet, whom history has been harsh, we think differently. We know that history is all there to be made in the future. Exhaustion is a mental thing. The absence of a spiritual viewpoint, a universal vision, a sense of new journeys, a higher discoveries. There is no exhaustion where there's much to be hoped for. much to work towards, and where the dreams and sufferings of our ancestors have not yet been realized or redeemed. This has been grounding for me. This has been healing for me, to know that as a society, we have built so many great things. We've done 5D, we've built technology, we've come up with so many great ideas on how to advance the world, but we've yet to eradicate poverty, genocides, killings. Lots of people live in suffering. And until we reach that point where people are no longer suffering, we have so much work to do. We have so much hope to have. And if you're exhausted, it's okay. Heal, but let the space be for other people who still have hope, who still have dreams to realize. So it's given me energy. I'm in my recovery process as well as I continue to do the work that I do in the spaces that I do, because a lot of violent things that happen in the spaces that we're in. But let's remember that humanity has realized so much, but we're still in our infancy or adolescence because we haven't eradicated racism, hatred, starvation, poverty, discriminations. Until we reach those things, we will not have reached our highest peak. So I hope that inspires someone today as well.
You definitely inspired me, and I can't top what you said, not that I would want to. But if anybody is going to doubt that we can do it, I want to remind us what March and April looked like for us. The world stopped. We came into our homes and we didn't leave. Work stopped. Economy stopped. Everything that was built on profits and not people stopped. Recovery is a good thing. It's a healing. And if we can actually change our mindset to be more inclusive, to be more aware of our friends, our neighbors, those around us, and that our differences only make us stronger, recovery means that we can heal and we can eradicate racism, poverty. We just have to be intentional about it and know that we have to try. And it starts with each one of us. So yeah. That conversation can continue for hours, by the way, but we can't, because we have to be respectful of your time, your generosity in sharing your perspectives, your incredible ideas. So you're not done with me yet, because I'll probably reach out to you in further emails to ask for some resources that you can share that we can send out to the people who have been kind enough to give us an hour and some minutes on this call. But without further ado, I'd like to once again recognize the companies or the organizations that have helped: Atlosa Family Healing Services, London Poverty Research Center, and Tech Alliance, Dylan Consulting for their contribution to Atlosa. And I want to go over to Christina Fox right now, who's with Tech Alliance, and thank you for helping us promote this. So Christina, over to you.
I've been very inspired. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you tonight, everybody. It's crucial that we continue to have conversations like these, and it's time for all of us to be awake, to be aware, and to act. At Tech Alliance, we do consider ourselves to be the place for dreamers, innovators, and world-changing ideas, and we are invested in our community. And like each of you, we are firm believers that innovation can really only emerge when we step outside of what we already know. And that's why we continue to seek collaborators like all of you in actioning real change. I have the great privilege of offering thanks to each of you tonight. So thank you, Javeed, Arielle, Andrea, Luis, Kate, and Mohammed for reaching into your own experiences and your own insights to bring perspective to our community. Thank you, Mayor Holder, for your contribution as well this evening. Thank you, Paul and Greg, our technical masterminds on the production side of this experience. As we uncover new opportunities to recover and rebuild beyond this pandemic, may we continue to encourage equity and inclusion in all of our spaces in pursuit of being champions with a diverse lens and elevating underrepresented yet incredibly valuable voices. Tonight has been really inspiring, and I'm so pleased to have joined you. Mohammed, thank you for sparking this conversation. We look forward to many more as we build on a commitment to prosperity for all. Back over to you.
Thank you. And that spark, to ignite the fire that lives within each one of us, that fire for humanity. I kind of end everything that I say, that we may come from many different backgrounds, but we form one nation, and that is humankind, just one nation. So please walk away today with what are things that you can change to make your neighborhood, your home, your workplace, your community a better place. We live in a wonderful city, but we have a lot of work to do together. Let's continue the conversations. There are more town halls that will be happening in September. but reach out to people who can help you, reach out to people who need to be helped, and stay safe, stay blessed, and let's be the change that we want to see in the world. Thank you. Peace.